History rarely remembers the quiet ones. Maria Cristina of Parma was born into a dynasty collapsing under its own weight, ignored by courts that once courted her bloodline, overshadowed by siblings who drew all the attention, and erased by political disasters she never caused. She lived without a crown, without a marriage, without a scandal. 3 things the world uses to decide whether a woman deserves a place in its memory. And so she slipped through the centuries, almost unnoticed. When she finally died at 68, in a modest room with no family by her side, the world did not pause. Her life ended exactly as she had lived it, softly, silently, and without anyone watching. Maria Cristina entered the world in 1779, as the 3rd daughter of a ducal couple already fractured long before she was born. And the environment she stepped into was one of whispered resentments, exhausted alliances, and an unspoken awareness that the Bourbon-Parma line was losing its footing in Europe. Parma, though technically a duchy of respectable lineage, existed at the crossroads of powers far larger than itself. And the family she was born into was already wilting under the political storms that swept across the continent. Her father, Duke Ferdinand, was known for a gentleness that made him beloved by his servants and useless to his advisors. He was a man who wore his crown like a burden rather than a privilege, preferring quiet study and conversation to the calculations and intrigues expected of a sovereign. Her mother, Archduchess Maria Amalia, stood in stark contrast, fiery, defiant, and marked by a rebellious streak that had alienated her from Vienna, her birthplace, and the heart of the Habsburg Empire. The marriage between Ferdinand and Maria Amalia had been arranged as part of a carefully plotted dynastic chess game. But once the pieces were set on the board, harmony never followed. Their union produced constant tension rather than political cohesion. And little Maria Cristina arrived into a household where love existed, but peace did not. From infancy, she was surrounded by the psychological ghosts of her parents' disappointments. Her father's frustrated attempts to govern with kindness, her mother's cycles of defiance and regret, and the constant sense of being observed, measured, and judged by the courts of Europe. The Parma Palace, while outwardly serene, contained undercurrents of diplomatic anxiety. Letters arrived regularly from Vienna, each one carrying subtle reminders of obligations unmet and alliances undone. Rumors drifted through the halls about Parma's diminishing relevance, about the Bourbon dynasty's fragility, about shifting loyalties in a world trembling under the first cracks of the coming French Revolution. As a child, Maria Cristina had no understanding of politics, but she absorbed its emotional residue. She grew up watching servants stiffen when certain names were spoken, watching her parents exchange looks laden with meanings she could not decipher, watching visiting diplomats leave the palace more troubled than when they arrived. In this uneasy world, Maria Cristina developed a temperament that seemed designed for survival. Soft-spoken, observant, endlessly patient, and careful never to draw unnecessary attention to herself. Her governesses described her as a child of silence, someone who preferred listening to speaking, someone who blended into the fringes of rooms rather than emerging into their center. While other royal children might shout, demand, or charm their way into notice, Maria Cristina simply existed, calm, unobtrusive, and content in ways that puzzled adults who expected royal children to be bold and assertive. Even her laughter was quiet, a delicate sound that disappeared quickly, as if she were afraid of letting it linger too long. Her earliest memories were shaped not by grand processions or glittering ceremonies, but by moments of stillness. Sitting by a window overlooking the palace gardens, watching her sisters chase butterflies she never attempted to touch, listening to the distant echo of her mother's voice raised in argument with an advisor, hearing her father's tired sighs during evening walks through the corridors. The maids, who often forgot she was in the room because of her gentle presence, would speak freely around her about matters ranging from the failing duchy to the tension between the Duke and Duchess. Thus, Maria Cristina learned early that the world outside her quiet routines was one of instability and disappointment, and she unconsciously shaped her personality to cause the least possible disturbance to the people already overwhelmed around her. And yet, her childhood was not devoid of warmth. Her father, though politically weak, adored his children with a tenderness that softened the sharp edges of palace life. He would sit with Maria Cristina by candlelight, reading aloud from devotional texts and teaching her the virtue of modesty. Lessons she absorbed not because she was expected to, but because they resonated with her naturally introspective nature. Her mother, despite her well-known defiance, had a complicated affection for her quieter children. There were moments when Maria Amalia would stroke Maria Cristina's hair absent-mindedly, perhaps finding in this gentle daughter a small reprieve from the political frustrations that plagued her. But these moments of tenderness were fleeting, lost in the larger turbulence of a marriage that had never found peace. For the young princess, the palace was both sanctuary and cage. The quiet corners she loved gave her solace, but they also reinforced her role as someone who lingered on the periphery of her own family story. When dignitaries visited, Maria Cristina was rarely presented. When festivities occurred, she stood behind her siblings. When important conversations unfolded, she watched from a distance, unnoticed. She did not resent this invisibility. She did not yet understand that it foreshadowed the entire trajectory of her life. Instead, she accepted it with the serene resignation of a child who believed her role in the world was to observe rather than to act. In many ways, Maria Cristina's early years laid the foundation for the tragedy of her adulthood. A life shaped by quietness, not chosen, but inherited. A destiny formed not by dramatic events, but by the slow erosion of opportunity, visibility, and significance. She was the child born into a family already dimming, a princess whose soft nature made her unsuited for the shifting tides of European power, and a witness to the gentle collapse of her family's position long before she had the words to describe it. It was this quiet beginning, filled with emotional shadows and fragile tenderness, that set her on the path to becoming one of history's most silently forgotten women. A princess who entered the world unnoticed and would, decades later, leave it in the same muted way. Maria Cristina's youth unfolded much like her childhood, quietly, gently, and so subtly that those around her often forgot to notice she was present at all. In a court where brightness was rewarded, where charm could secure alliances and beauty could open doors to powerful marriages, she remained a soft outline at the edge of every scene. Her siblings seemed to step effortlessly into the roles expected of royal children. Her elder sister Carolina inherited their mother's vivacity, commanding attention whenever she entered a room. Charlotte, deeply admired for her striking looks and refined manners, became the subject of admiring whispers each time the court gathered. Her brother Louis, though fragile in health, carried the burden of a future ruler. His very existence was important, and thus courtiers, tutors, and ambassadors orbited around him constantly. Against this backdrop, Maria Cristina was a muted presence, and the contrast between her and her siblings grew more pronounced with each passing year. Even in formal settings, where royal children were trained to perform with precision, Maria Cristina faded into the background. Court diarists of the time, who dutifully recorded the gestures, clothing, and comments of those deemed noteworthy, rarely wrote her name. When they did, it was only in passing. The quiet daughter, or the timid princess standing near the window. There is no record of her making a memorable remark, causing a stir, or inspiring admiration or criticism. She did not possess her mother's rebellious streak or her father's gentle charisma. She did not display exceptional intelligence, musical talent, or a flair for languages, qualities often used to craft narratives around lesser-known royal daughters. Instead, her defining characteristic seemed to be her ability to disappear in plain sight. And yet, her invisibility was not the result of a lack of depth. Those who interacted with her more intimately often sensed a contemplative intelligence beneath her quiet demeanor. Her tutors noted her capacity for focus, especially in subjects that required patience rather than creativity, needlework, scripture study, and the daily rituals of devotion. She read slowly but thoughtfully, absorbing ideas rather than racing through them. When asked for her opinion, she spoke so softly that her words often had to be repeated by someone standing nearby. This softness was interpreted, mistakenly, as emptiness. In truth, it was simply the outward expression of an inward life, shaped by caution, an instinctive understanding that her voice carried little weight in a household already burdened by louder conflicts. At court balls and celebrations, this dynamic became even more painfully visible. While her sisters glided across polished floors, exchanging smiles and tentative flirtations with young nobles, Maria Cristina lingered near the musicians or found a quiet corner where she would fold her hands and watch. She did not hate these events. She simply did not know how to exist within them. Dresses that shimmered on her sisters seemed to overwhelm her, as if their brightness made her retreat further into herself. When young men approached the group of princesses, they bowed first to Carolina and Charlotte, occasionally offering a polite nod to Maria Cristina without meeting her eyes. She never took offense. It simply confirmed what she already believed. She was not meant to shine. Her mother, whose own youth had been marked by defiance and the pursuit of personal freedom, struggled to understand this daughter who never demanded anything. Maria Amalia valued passion, sharp wit, and a strong sense of self. Maria Cristina, in her view, possessed none of these. As a result, the Duchess lavished attention on her more vibrant children while leaving the quieter ones to the care of governesses. Maria Cristina rarely sought an audience with her mother and became accustomed to interacting with her only during formal gatherings, where expectations forced them into the same room. Their relationship was cordial but distant, as if they were two women bound by blood but not by temperament. Her father, ever gentle, watched this child with a mixture of affection and concern. He sensed that she was easily overlooked and tried, in small ways, to create space for her. He assigned her the quieter tasks of the household, tending to the chapel flowers, assisting elderly nobles with correspondence, or reading aloud to him in the evenings. These moments were the closest she came to feeling useful. Yet even Duke Ferdinand could not shield her from the political reality that shaped every royal child's destiny. Daughters were expected to charm potential suitors, to be visible, to display qualities that could strengthen dynastic ties. And Maria Cristina, through no fault of her own, failed to fit that mold. As she entered adolescence, the court's perception of her evolved from gentle indifference to quiet pity. It became increasingly clear that she was not a princess who would attract strategic marriage negotiations. There were murmurs, subtle at first, suggesting that she lacked the presence required for royal alliances. Diplomats, when visiting Parma, focused on her siblings and did not request formal introductions to her. Invitations for her to participate in international ceremonies were rare. Even portrait artists favored the more striking members of the family, leaving only a handful of simple, uninspired images of Maria Cristina in her youth. In private moments, she became aware of this growing invisibility. She watched her sisters prepare for dinners, their hair adorned with pearls, their gowns fitted by skilled seamstresses. She heard them discuss the attentions they received from young nobles and the compliments whispered behind fans. She did not envy them. She simply wondered why she did not feel the same expectations placed upon her. She sensed, without being told, that she was not a priority, not a daughter whose future was being actively planned. The realization did not break her heart. It simply settled within her like a quiet truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Maria Cristina's youth was thus defined by a paradox. She lived at the heart of a royal court, surrounded by opulence, ceremony, and political ambition. Yet she inhabited it as though she were a faint shadow cast behind brighter figures. Her presence did not offend, impress, or provoke. It barely registered at all. And within this unnoticed existence, the tragic outline of her life was already forming. She was becoming the kind of princess history forgets, not through scandal or failure, but through an unassuming gentleness that left no mark on the world around her. The transition from adolescence to adulthood is often the moment when a royal daughter's path becomes defined. When suitors begin to circle, when dynastic negotiations take shape, and when her value to the political landscape is finally measured. For Maria Cristina, however, adulthood arrived not with opportunity, but with a quiet closing of doors. From the moment she turned 16, a subtle but unmistakable truth settled over the court of Parma. No one was coming for her. No envoys arrived to ask after her temperament. No discreet letters from foreign courts requested information about her upbringing or education. No portraits were commissioned to be sent to potential husbands abroad. While her sisters' futures were subjects of conversation, speculation, and negotiation, Maria Cristina's future remained a blank page, an empty space no one seemed interested in filling. Ordinarily, even a princess of modest strategic value could expect at least tentative discussions about marriage alliances. Yet the late 18th century was no ordinary time. Europe was trembling under the weight of ideological upheaval. The French Revolution was tearing ancient institutions apart. Napoleon's rise was beginning to reshape the political map, and once powerful dynasties were losing influence at a pace that would have seemed unthinkable only a generation earlier. Against this backdrop, the Duchy of Parma, never a major player, fell rapidly into irrelevance. Its worth as an ally diminished with each diplomatic failure, each internal conflict, and each decision mishandled by Maria Cristina's parents. Other royal houses no longer saw Parma as a bridge to power, but rather as a minor, troubled state with little to offer. If Parma itself was losing value, then its daughters, especially the quieter, less gifted ones, lost value even faster. Carolina and Charlotte still carried the advantage of beauty and lively personalities, traits that could make them appealing even when politics wavered. But Maria Cristina, who neither dazzled nor charmed, was not a princess who could compensate for a failing alliance with personal magnetism. Diplomats described her as pleasant but unremarkable, a phrase that might as well have been a seal closing the door on all her prospects. Her lack of visibility, once simply a feature of her temperament, now became a measurable disadvantage. Her mother, Maria Amalia, who had once fought fiercely for her own independence and refused to be controlled by Vienna, had neither the time nor the inclination to fight for this daughter's future. Her attention was consumed by political disputes, by her strained marriage, and by her own diminishing relevance. She wanted her livelier daughters placed well. She did not see the need to invest her fading influence on Maria Cristina, whom she saw, incorrectly, as content with domestic quietude. Her father, gentle and well-meaning, lacked the political leverage to secure a match, even if he had tried. Thus, Maria Cristina was left in a peculiar state of uncertainty. She was not rejected outright. She was simply never considered. As the years passed, the silence around her grew louder. It became evident that she was entering her 20s without the faintest outline of a marital future. At court gatherings, whispers circulated about her increasingly unlikely prospects. Ladies-in-waiting wondered aloud, with pity, not malice, what would become of the third daughter if no husband appeared. Older nobles, with the bluntness of age, remarked that not every princess is made for diplomacy. Even her sisters, absorbed in their own preparations for marriage or social advancement, seldom mentioned her in discussions about the future. Maria Cristina herself felt the change, though she spoke of it to no one. She noticed the way her sisters' gowns were chosen with suitors in mind, while hers were selected merely for modest appropriateness. She noticed the way her mother's eyes passed over her at formal dinners, resting longer on the daughters who still held political promise. She noticed, above all, the absence of curiosity. No one asked about her hopes, her wishes, or her dreams, because no one expected them to matter. She wondered at times whether a different temperament would have changed her fate. Had she possessed Carolina's boldness or Charlotte's radiance? Would envoys have taken interest despite Parma's declining importance? Would some minor prince or distant cousin of a ruling house have asked for her hand? But these were questions without answers. Maria Cristina had not been fashioned for the roles that Europe demanded of its royal women, and Europe had no intention of creating room for someone who did not naturally fit. By the time she reached her mid-20s, the unspoken truth had hardened into reality. She was unmarriageable. Not in the scandalous sense. There was no blemish on her reputation, no impropriety that deterred alliances, but in the colder, more indifferent sense that no one saw a reason to claim her. Royal marriage was a currency, and she held none of the traits that made her a valuable asset. The Bourbon Parma name was tarnished, the duchy's future uncertain, and her own personality too quiet to compensate. She became, in the vocabulary of the age, a woman left within her family, destined to live out her days in their shadow, neither nun nor wife, neither political figure nor household matriarch. Ironically, Maria Cristina herself was the last person to speak of this fate with bitterness. She did not rage or protest, did not demand explanation or intervention. Instead, she folded into herself more deeply, accepting the quiet shaping of her life as if it were simply the way things were meant to be. Her sense of self had never been tied to ambition. She had grown up believing she was peripheral, so it was not a shock to learn that the world agreed. But acceptance does not diminish tragedy. In many ways, her lack of protest made her fate sadder, for it showed how thoroughly she had learned, from childhood, that her desires were irrelevant. Thus, even before exile and obscurity descended on her family, Maria Cristina's future had already ended. The palace corridors she walked each day no longer echoed with possibility, but with the knowledge that her story, in the eyes of her world, was already complete. She was a princess with no destiny, a woman whose life would not be shaped by marriage, power, or public relevance. Her remaining years would unfold in silence, a silence that had begun long before anyone realized it. The year 1802 marked a turning point not only for the Duchy of Parma, but for the quiet, nearly invisible life Maria Cristina had been living until then. When Napoleon dissolved Parma and stripped her father of his sovereignty, the fragile stability of her sheltered world shattered overnight. For many royal families, exile came with drama, protest, and political maneuvering. For Maria Cristina, it arrived as yet another silent shift. One more door closing, one more layer of her already narrow life falling away. What had once been a modest but dignified court now collapsed into a nomadic existence, defined by hurried departures, borrowed lodgings, and the constant, humiliating awareness of dependence on the goodwill of other dynasties. Maria Cristina followed her parents first to Vienna, a city that should have felt like home given her mother's Habsburg blood. But it did not. Vienna was polite, distant, and ceremonial in its hospitality, an empire offering shelter, not affection. The Habsburg court received the exiled family with formality, but there was no warmth behind the gestures. Maria Amalia's strained history with her own relatives cast a long shadow over their arrival. The courtiers who bowed respectfully to Duke Ferdinand and his children did so out of obligation, not sympathy, and as soon as protocol allowed, they returned to their conversations about affairs more important than the displaced Bourbon Parma family. For Maria Cristina, who already struggled to feel visible within her own home, Vienna's polite indifference only deepened her sense of detachment. Their lodgings in Vienna were comfortable but impersonal. Rooms assigned to them not because anyone cared, but because a fallen duchess and her family could not be allowed to wander the empire without shelter. Maria Cristina occupied a small bedroom overlooking a courtyard she seldom ventured into. Her days were structured around the rhythm of displaced royalty, morning prayers in borrowed chapels, quiet meals taken out of sight of the Habsburg elite, and long afternoons filled with needlework or reading. Occasionally, distant relatives would invite the family to small gatherings. But Maria Cristina was rarely included in these gestures. Social events now centered around diplomatic usefulness, and she, without marriage prospects, political relevance, or personal influence, was almost never considered necessary. After a year in Vienna, the family relocated to Prague, a move that felt less like a relocation and more like another quiet retreat. Prague was calmer, quieter, less formal than Vienna, but it was also lonelier. Here, the Bourbon Parma family seemed to sink even further into obscurity. They lived in a modest residence provided by the Habsburg administration, a place where the grandeur of past ducal authority felt like a fading dream. Maria Cristina, already accustomed to the subtler rhythms of palace life, adapted quickly to this new environment. If anything, the stillness of exile suited her temperament more than the ceremonial stiffness of Vienna ever had. She settled into a routine of small domestic habits, tending to indoor plants, writing brief letters that were seldom answered, and listening to the distant bells of Prague's churches echo through narrow streets she rarely walked. But exile brought with it a more painful change, one that even her gentle resignation struggled to withstand. Royal courts had always ignored her, but now history itself began to erase her. She no longer appeared in official documents. Few mentions of her were made in correspondence. No painters were commissioned to preserve her image in exile. Her sisters occasionally received inquiries from foreign courts about their welfare or future. But no such letters ever bore Maria Cristina's name. The invisibility that had marked her childhood now spread into adulthood with an almost cruel inevitability. And exile did not end in Prague. When political pressure mounted yet again, the family moved to Saxony, drifting across Germanic territories in search of quiet refuge. Each move carved more pieces away from their identity, reducing them from a ruling house to a wandering relic of Europe's past. For her parents, exile was humiliation. For her siblings, it was a disruption of their ambitions. But for Maria Cristina, it was simply the final confirmation of what she had always sensed: that she did not belong to the world of courts, diplomacy, or public life. The map of Europe was shifting, and she moved with it like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarked upon. The spaces she lived in grew smaller with each transition. Gone were the wide corridors of Parma, the echoing halls where she once observed life without participating in it. Exile quarters were narrow, rooms arranged closely together, furniture reused and repurposed, meals shared quietly without the ceremonial grandeur of past years. Maria Cristina spent most of her time indoors, seated near a window where the light was strongest, embroidering patterns that only she would ever see. Occasionally, she joined her family for walks, but she always positioned herself slightly behind the others, not out of obligation, but out of habit. It is telling that during this period, the years when she traveled the most, witnessed the collapse of her family's political identity, and experienced life beyond the borders of Parma. Almost no records mention her thoughts, her reactions, or her presence. She seemed to dissolve into the fabric of exile, becoming part of the background scenery rather than a participant in it. Even letters written by those who lived with her focused on her parents or more prominent siblings, leaving Maria Cristina as a nameless daughter folding quietly into the margins of every narrative. This was the era when European history shifted violently, when royals fell and rose with dizzying speed, when dynasties were remade and territories redrawn. And yet, in the midst of all these sweeping movements, Maria Cristina experienced the collapse of her world not as drama, but as silence, an unbroken continuation of a life defined by gentle erasure. Exile did not transform her. It merely stripped away the last external traces of her identity, leaving behind a woman whose existence was recorded only in shadows. By the time the family settled into their final Habsburg refuge, Maria Cristina had fully embraced the life of a woman who expected nothing, asked for nothing, and wished only for quiet. She was no longer a princess displaced by political upheaval. She was simply a person living in the background of history, unnoticed even by those closest to her. And it was in this quiet, colorless drifting between capitals and temporary homes that the trajectory of her life became irreversible. A descent not into tragedy by catastrophe, but into tragedy by fading, the silent vanishing of someone the world never bothered to see. By the time Maria Cristina reached middle age, her life had contracted into a world so small and so quiet that it seemed to resemble not the existence of a princess, but the gentle, disciplined solitude of a cloistered nun. Exile had stripped away the expectations once tied to her birth. Time had stripped away the faint hopes her family might once have entertained for her. And circumstance had stripped away the presence of siblings who gradually married, died, or drifted into their own isolated corners of Europe. What remained was a woman whose days unfolded with deliberate softness, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last, each marked by the same subdued rituals that gave her life its fragile structure. In the modest Habsburg apartments where she spent these years, first in Saxony and later in the quieter outskirts of imperial towns, Maria Cristina found a rhythm that suited her naturally contemplative temperament. Her mornings began before sunrise, partly out of habit and partly because sleep often eluded her. She would sit by the window in her thin shawl, watching the sky shift from gray to pale gold over rooftops she never ventured toward. Servants sometimes passed below, their hurried footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. But inside her room, the air remained still. A small, well-worn prayer book lay open on her lap, though in truth, she rarely read more than a few lines before allowing her thoughts to drift. She embroidered most mornings, a skill she had learned as a child, but had only now come to rely on as a source of calm. Her pieces were not grand tapestries destined for palace walls. They were small works, flowers, delicate borders, the initials of saints, thin vines looping around simple symbols. She gifted these pieces to servants or to the few acquaintances who exchanged polite visits with her, though she never knew whether they were treasured or quietly put away. The act of stitching mattered more than the result. It occupied her hands, kept her mind from spiraling inward, and brought a kind of quiet dignity to hours that might otherwise have felt empty. Meals were equally modest. She had no appetite for elaborate dishes, and over time her diet narrowed to soups, bread, soft vegetables, and occasionally fruit when her health allowed. Her attendants often expressed concern about how little she ate, but she would simply smile and say that too much indulgence made her feel crowded, a word she used not only for food, but for anything that disrupted the fragile balance of her days. Her relationship to the world had become one of gentle withdrawal. She did not reject life, but she engaged with it only in small, careful doses. Letters formed another fragment of her daily routine, though they came irregularly. She wrote to distant relatives, to the handful of siblings who still lived, to a few aging ladies in waiting who had once served her mother. Her handwriting was described as neat but faint, as though she did not want to trouble the paper. In her letters, she rarely mentioned herself. Instead, she asked after others, offered prayers, or commented on the passing of seasons. What she did not write, but felt deeply, was the sense that these correspondences were thinning with every year. Replies came slowly, often sent by someone else on behalf of an infirm relative, and some never came at all. She would wait patiently, then place the unanswered letter into a box beneath her table, never expressing disappointment, as though she expected silence more than she expected words. Social gatherings, once a source of discomfort, became something she no longer even attempted to attend. Her aversion to noise, to unfamiliar faces, and to the performative nature of court life intensified with age. Diplomats and visiting nobles knew of her existence, but they rarely requested an audience. When they did, she declined gently, claiming ill health or fatigue. Her attendants would prepare her sitting room just in case she changed her mind, but she never did. The very idea of entering a room full of people, hearing the swell of their voices, and feeling their eyes upon her was overwhelming. Solitude, once simply a preference, had become a necessity. Despite the growing isolation, she was not bitter. Those who spent time near her remarked that she carried an aura of peaceful resignation, as though she had accepted her path long ago and had no desire to remake it. But they also noted the sadness woven through her silence, the way her eyes lingered on doorways after guests left, the way her hands paused mid-stitch when distant laughter echoed down the hall, the way her breath caught slightly when a letter arrived for someone else. She did not envy others. She simply lived with the ache of being forgotten. Her world shrank further as her health began to falter. Weakness in her joints made it difficult to move, so she limited herself to slow walks around her room or brief steps into the adjoining corridor. Her attendants spoke in hushed tones about her reluctance to see physicians, but she insisted that her ailments were ordinary for someone who lives quietly. She avoided remedies that disrupted her routine, refusing tonics that caused restlessness or treatments that required her to leave her quarters. It was as though her body was mirroring her life, growing softer, retreating inward, becoming quieter each year. Through all of this, her faith remained her anchor. She prayed not dramatically, not with fervor, but with steady, consistent devotion. Her rosary beads, smooth from decades of handling, rested on a small table beside her bed. Her prayers were not for glory, not for recognition, but for peace, for forgiveness, and for the well-being of others. If she ever prayed for herself, no one knew. By the time she approached her 50s, Maria Cristina existed almost entirely within the perimeter of a few small rooms. Her life resembled that of a gentle soul tucked away in a convent. Except she had no community of women who shared her path, no abbess guiding her, no structure except what she built for herself. What she had instead was silence, vast, enveloping, and constant. And though she accepted it with humility, it slowly eroded her from within. Her days were marked not by events, but by repetitions, each one softening her presence a little more, each one preparing her for the deeper solitude that awaited in the final years of her life. By the time Maria Cristina entered her late 50s, the soft quiet that had shaped her life for decades began to settle more heavily upon her body. Isolation, once merely an emotional landscape, started to manifest itself physically in ways she could no longer ignore. The rhythm of her days, fragile, predictable, and centered around small routines, was increasingly interrupted by bouts of pain, dizziness, and fatigue that left her unable to rise from her bed for hours, sometimes days. What had begun as a gentle withdrawal from the world was now becoming a forced retreat, as though her body was following the same path her life had traced, inward, downward, and into silence. The first sign was the stiffness in her joints. It started with her hands, the same delicate hands that had spent years embroidering in quiet rooms. She found herself struggling to hold a needle, the thread slipping from her grasp, her fingers trembling without warning. What had once brought her peace now brought frustration. She would sit for long moments staring at unfinished patterns, knowing she no longer had the steady control needed to complete them. When her attendant suggested warmer compresses or herbal tinctures, she smiled politely and said she preferred not to trouble her body with too many remedies. But the truth was simpler. She did not fear the deterioration. She expected it. Soon after came the headaches, slow, pulsing aches that spread like a gray fog from behind her eyes to the back of her skull. Some days, light itself became her enemy. She would sit in her dim room with curtains drawn, pressing her palms against her temples as the sound of footsteps in the corridor echoed like distant thunder inside her head. Reading, her one reliable comfort, became nearly impossible. Her vision blurred unpredictably, and words on the page seemed to drift like smoke. She often kept the book open beside her, touching the edges of the paper as though proximity alone could preserve the solace she once found in reading. Her appetite diminished as well. Meals, already modest, became almost symbolic. Spoonfuls of broth she pushed around the bowl, small slices of fruit she barely tasted, a crust of bread nibbled without interest. Her attendants fretted over her declining weight, but she brushed aside their concerns with the tender resignation of someone who had grown accustomed to fading. "It is enough," she would murmur, even when it was clearly not. She no longer felt hunger as other people did. Instead, she felt a persistent heaviness in her chest, a sense of being weighed down by her own breath. Food felt unnecessary, like an obligation rather than nourishment. Sleep, too, abandoned her. Nights stretched into long corridors of wakefulness. She would lie in the dark listening to her own breathing, feeling the ache in her limbs grow sharper in the cold hours before dawn. Sometimes she drifted into shallow rest, only to be awakened by the sound of her own heart beating too loudly in her ears. Attendants found her seated in a chair the next morning, her rosary beads dangling loosely from her fingers, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. When they asked whether she had slept, she simply said, "I closed my eyes," as though that was enough. Loneliness, which had accompanied her for most of her life, now sharpened into something heavier. She no longer had the strength to take even short walks in the corridor, so the few interactions she once had with passing servants or occasional visitors became rarer. Days could pass without her seeing another face. Letters grew scarcer. Many of the relatives she once corresponded with had died or become too infirm to write. Her siblings were either gone or absorbed in their own struggles. Even the ladies-in-waiting who had stayed loyal to her family in exile were aging, their duties reduced by time and illness. The world she grew up in had vanished, and no new world had come to replace it. Her attendants began to notice small, telling moments. The way she lingered near the doorway after someone left, her eyes following them as though she wanted to speak but lacked the strength. The way she paused before sitting, as if trying to recall what it felt like to move without pain. The way she whispered prayers, not with hope, but with a kind of weary gratitude that the day was ending. She seemed to shrink, not physically, though her frame did grow frail, but spiritually, her presence becoming softer, more translucent, as though she were slowly stepping away from the world without waiting for death to claim her. One attendant later recalled her most common whispered sentence, spoken almost as a confession. "I have lived too long in silence. Perhaps God has forgotten me." She said it without despair, without accusation, simply as a statement of truth from someone who had spent decades watching herself fade. Her faith had not abandoned her, but it had transformed. She no longer prayed for change. She prayed for acceptance, for quiet transitions, for the gentleness she had always extended to others to be extended to her at the end. And yet, even in these final years of increasing frailty, Maria Cristina maintained a fragile dignity. She never complained, never demanded, never lamented out loud. Her suffering was internal, muted, carried with the same unobtrusive grace that had marked her life. She moved slowly, spoke softly, and breathed as though trying not to disturb the air around her. She had become, in her solitude, a figure almost monastic. One who lived not in the world, but adjacent to it, suspended in a quiet that deepened with each passing day. In this final descent into isolation and illness, the tragedy of her life became starkly clear. Maria Cristina was not a woman undone by scandal, war, or catastrophe. She was undone by invisibility, by the gradual erosion of presence, by the long years of living without being seen. Her weakening body was not just a sign of age. It was the physical manifestation of a life spent in silence, a body slowly following the path her spirit had walked long before. By the 1830s, Maria Cristina had reached an age when most royal women, if they survived that long, were surrounded by grandchildren, woven into the dynastic tapestry as matriarchs whose letters, portraits, and public gestures helped shape the next generation. But Maria Cristina, unmarried and unremembered, occupied no such place. She lived in the margins of a world that had long stopped noticing her. And by this point, the erasure that had shadowed her life became complete. History did not strike her down with a single blow. It simply closed around her like a fog, layer by layer, until she vanished, not because anyone wished her gone, but because no one remembered to look for her. This disappearance was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, gently, almost imperceptibly, just as everything else in her life had. Records from this period show a startling absence. Royal correspondences that once at least mentioned her name in passing no longer included her at all. Political reports, genealogical notes, and court diaries that had cataloged the movements of European nobility omitted her completely. Even the letters her siblings exchanged rarely referenced her, as if she were a distant childhood memory that had faded beyond recognition. Part of this disappearance was due to geography. The Habsburg estates where she lived were far removed from the power centers of Vienna or Paris, places where history was actively written and rewritten. Maria Cristina resided in secondary residences, quiet towns, and borrowed wings of larger households. Spaces where record keepers seldom visited and where the activities of a nearly silent princess held little relevance to the administration of empires. When clerks compiled annual reports of court presence, they listed the names of ambassadors, noble families, officials, and visiting royalty. Maria Cristina was none of these. She was simply there, but presence without function rarely survives in ink. Another reason for her erasure lay in the nature of European monarchy itself. The early decades of the 19th century were a whirlwind of dynastic reshuffling. With Napoleon defeated and conservative regimes restored, new alliances were forged, old grievances were revived, and political narratives were rewritten to justify the shifting landscape. In these grand revisions, figures like Maria Cristina had no place. She had produced no heirs, held no office, hosted no salons, sponsored no artists, and left behind no political imprint. History, as written by her contemporaries, prioritized those who acted, fought, ruled, or died dramatically. A quiet woman living in borrowed rooms had nothing to offer these narratives. Even family memory began to dim. Her surviving siblings, scattered across Europe, were occupied by their own struggles. Marriages that disappointed them, courts that used them, illnesses that consumed them. They visited rarely and wrote infrequently. When they did see her, they found a sister whose voice had become soft enough to miss and whose life had become so still that it was difficult to know what to speak about. She was not estranged. She was simply forgotten, not out of cruelty, but out of inertia. The world moved quickly. Maria Cristina did not move at all. Her attendants noticed this fading long before anyone else. They saw how fewer visitors asked after her, how fewer letters arrived, how even the clergy sent younger priests who did not know her name. They watched as her title, Princess Maria Cristina of Parma, was replaced informally by the Quiet Lady or the Duke's daughter, vague references that stripped away the identity she had once possessed. To many who encountered her in these final decades, she was not a princess at all, merely an elderly woman living under Habsburg protection, someone whose noble lineage felt too distant to matter. Perhaps the most telling sign of her erasure was the decline in portraiture. In royal Europe, portraits served as both propaganda and memory, capturing even the most insignificant nobles in oil and canvas to assert their place in the world. But for Maria Cristina, there were none. Not a single commissioned portrait is known from her exile years. The vibrant depictions of her siblings and parents found places in archives, museums, and private collections. Her image, however, faded from the visual record entirely. She became a royal without a face, an almost unthinkable fate in a society obsessed with lineage. As she aged, her physical absence from public life reinforced this historical disappearance. She rarely left her rooms, seldom appeared in formal gatherings, and avoided the small ceremonies that marked religious or courtly events. Her absence became expected, then accepted, then ignored. It reached a point where, if she did appear, few recognized her, and fewer still knew how to greet her. She had become a ghost long before death, a figure drifting between worlds, present in body, absent in the stories people told. The broader historical moment also played a role. The revolutions of 1830 and the social upheavals that followed redirected Europe's attention entirely. People cared about constitutions, riots, and political reform. They debated the collapse of old orders and the rise of new ideologies. No one had time or reason to think of a vanished Parma princess living quietly in an unremarkable room. Thus, Maria Cristina's erasure was not a tragedy of violence or betrayal, but of indifference. It was the quietest kind of disappearance. Not dramatic enough to be mourned, not scandalous enough to be recorded, not influential enough to be recalled. She lived in the spaces between history's sentences, in the margins of its pages, until even those margins were turned and forgotten. By the 1840s, Maria Cristina existed only to the handful of people who brought her meals, adjusted her curtains, or lit her candles. To everyone else, she had already disappeared. And in that vanishing, her life reached its most profound truth. She was a woman erased not by hatred, but by silence. A silence so complete that history itself eventually stopped remembering she had ever lived. On the morning of July 27, 1847, nothing in the quiet estate where Maria Cristina lived suggested that history was about to close its doors forever on one of its most forgotten daughters. Dawn rose softly over the Habsburg countryside, the air cool and still, the corridors silent except for the faint movements of servants beginning their daily tasks. No physicians had been summoned during the night. No relatives had been alerted. No preparations had been made for a passing that anyone expected or even thought to anticipate. After all, Maria Cristina had spent years living in such fragile quiet that the line between life and death had become almost indistinguishable. For those around her, she was already a fading presence, a gentle shadow drifting slowly toward the edge of existence. Her final hours were marked not by crisis, but by stillness. The lady-in-waiting who tended her during those years later wrote that Maria Cristina had seemed more tired than usual the previous evening, though it was difficult to distinguish such exhaustion from her habitual fragility. She had eaten only a little broth at supper, thanked the attendant with her usual soft nod, and asked for her window to remain slightly open so she could feel the night air. There was nothing dramatic, nothing foreboding, only the ordinary quiet that defined her life. When her attendant wished her good night, Maria Cristina whispered a faint blessing in return, her voice barely audible over the rustle of linen. Sometime deep in the night, while the world around her remained untouched by urgency, her breathing grew slower, softer. There was no struggle, no gasp for air, no calling out for help. According to the lone witness, who would later recount the moment, Maria Cristina seemed to drift into sleep with her hands folded over the rosary she kept by her side, its beads worn smooth by decades of gentle handling. For several minutes, nothing appeared unusual. She looked as she always did when resting, small, pale, withdrawn into the private quiet that had carried her through so many years. Only when the attendant approached to adjust her shawl did she realize that the princess was no longer breathing. She slipped into death as if falling asleep, the attendant wrote, and for minutes no one realized she had gone. Those words capture the devastating truth of Maria Cristina's end. It was so gentle, so muted, so entirely in keeping with her life that even the moment of her departure went unnoticed. There were no attendants rushing through halls, no frantic summons for clergy, no final words delivered with trembling emotion. Death visited her as quietly as life had kept her, and the two became indistinguishable in the simplicity of her final breath. No family member was present. Her siblings were scattered across Europe, their own lives touched by illness, duty, or indifference. The Duke of Parma, the title that once defined her lineage, was a relic of another age, long dissolved by war and revolution. Her parents had died years earlier, and whatever remained of the court that once surrounded them had been reduced to fragments of memory. Maria Cristina's passing did not interrupt anyone's schedule. It did not appear in diplomatic bulletins. No one traveled hurriedly to be with her in her final moments. She left the world exactly as she had lived in it, unseen. When the small household realized what had happened, their reaction was one of subdued shock rather than alarm. They notified the local cleric, who arrived late that morning with a quiet solemnity, carrying the tools of a ritual he knew would be witnessed by only a few. The priest offered prayers over her still body, prayers spoken more out of duty than personal connection, for he hardly knew the woman whose soul he was commending to God. The attendants dressed her in a simple gown, far from the elaborate garments that marked the deaths of more prominent royal figures. They placed her rosary in her hands and arranged her hair with the tenderness owed to someone who had lived without asking anything of anyone. No grand funeral cortege followed. No royal family traveled to honor her. No proclamations were issued in her memory. A short announcement was noted in a minor local registry, a mere line acknowledging the death of Maria Cristina, daughter of the late Duke Ferdinand of Parma. It contained no elaboration because there was nothing to elaborate. There were no political consequences, no estates to divide, no heirs to notify. Her life ended in administrative minimalism, the world responding to her death with the same quiet indifference that had shaped her existence. In the days that followed, her room remained exactly as she had left it. Her prayer book lay open to the final psalm she had read. Her embroidery frame still held a half-finished pattern she never had the strength to complete. The chair by her window, worn smooth by years of use, faced the same direction, as though waiting for her to return and resume her silent vigil over the world outside. But she would not return. The quiet space that had once held her presence now held only an absence so faint that even those closest to her struggled to articulate what had been lost. For most royal deaths, memory crystallizes, portraits painted, eulogies spoken, legacies recorded. For Maria Cristina, there was nothing. Her passing generated no discourse, no reflection, no attempt at remembrance. It was a quiet closing of a nearly invisible chapter. Even the date of her death, so precisely recorded in her lifetime, faded into obscurity in subsequent decades, appearing in scattered genealogies like a footnote beneath footnotes. Her burial, too, echoed the muted tone of her death. There was no elaborate tomb, no marble effigy, no grand inscription asserting her identity for generations to come. She was laid to rest with modest ceremony, her name carved simply, almost timidly, into stone, an austere marker for a life lived in the margins. Over time, the stone weathered, the letters dulled. Visitors to the cemetery saw her grave without seeing her story, walking past without pausing. Thus ended the life of a princess the world forgot long before she ever died. And in this final quiet, this absence of mourning, of legacy, of acknowledgement, lies the most haunting truth of all. Maria Cristina did not leave the world. The world had already left her. In the years following Maria Cristina's death, the world shifted swiftly toward industrialization, nationalism, and new political ideologies, leaving little room for the slow, quiet tragedies of forgotten princesses. History textbooks filled with the names of conquerors, reformers, revolutionaries, and dynasties that shaped continents. In such narratives, a woman like Maria Cristina, who left behind no children, no reforms, no scandals, no patronage, no court faction, and no political voice, seemed to have no place at all. And yet, her very absence from history's grand narratives is precisely what makes her legacy so haunting. She represents the countless individuals, especially women, whose lives were never deemed significant enough to remember, not because they lacked humanity, but because they lacked utility to those in power. Maria Cristina life stands as a testament to the quiet casualties of dynastic politics. Royal birth is often romanticized in stories that focus on splendor, privilege, and influence. But for many princesses, it created cages rather than corridors of opportunity. Maria Cristina was born into privilege, but her life was shaped almost entirely by what she was not. Not politically valuable, not strikingly beautiful in a way courts admired, not charismatic, not rebellious, not married, not a mother, not a figure of scandal. In the rigid hierarchy of European royalty, the absence of these traits rendered her invisible, even within her own family. Her legacy, therefore, lies not in what she achieved, but in what her life reveals about the structures that ignored her. Her story forces us to confront a rarely acknowledged truth. History's silence is often deliberate. It favors those who leave loud marks, victories, failures, wars, treaties, disasters. It favors drama, conflict, transformation. What it does not preserve are the lives shaped by gentleness, resignation, or quiet suffering. Maria Cristina's erasure is not an accident. It is the product of a system that valued royal women only when they advanced political goals or reinforced dynastic continuity. When a woman failed to fulfill these roles, history simply stepped around her, leaving no trace. She becomes invisible not because she lacked worth, but because her worth did not align with the narrow criteria used to determine who deserves remembrance. And yet, in this invisibility lies a hidden power. Maria Cristina's life, when examined carefully, offers a lens onto the emotional and psychological cost of dynastic systems that constrained and silenced women for centuries. She embodied a kind of internal exile long before political exile forced her across Europe. Her existence demonstrates how a person can be surrounded by wealth and still have no agency, surrounded by family, yet still be profoundly alone. The quietness of her tragedy is precisely what gives it universal resonance. In a world obsessed with achievement and legacy, Maria Cristina speaks to the sorrow of lives that unfold in the shadows. Lives of those who are overlooked, undervalued, or simply forgotten. Her story also has the potential to illuminate our understanding of royal history beyond the usual narratives of grandeur. When we look at figures like Maria Cristina, we see the human side of monarchy. The vulnerability, the limitations, the emotional fragility that elite histories often conceal. Royal courts rarely documented daily loneliness, unfulfilled hopes, or the existential weight of living without purpose. But Maria Cristina's life suggests that these silent struggles were far more common than the official record admits. Her gentle dignity, her quiet endurance, and the slow fading of her presence challenge the assumption that royalty equates to power. Her story reveals the opposite, that royal women could be trapped in lives where even their sadness went unnoticed. Another aspect of her legacy lies in the broader reflection she provokes on memory itself. What we choose to remember and what we allow to disappear. Maria Cristina demonstrates how memory can be shaped not only by deeds, but by the absence of them. Her life raises questions about the fairness of historical remembrance. Why do some people leave their mark through fortune or misfortune, while others vanish no matter how long they lived or how quietly they suffered? What does it mean that a princess, someone born into a world designed to record every detail of noble life, could slip so fully beneath the surface of history that her existence barely registers? And yet, there is another, more intimate legacy she leaves behind. One not recorded in documents, but in the faint impressions preserved in letters, diaries, and the recollections of those who served her. These whispers paint a picture of a gentle woman who harmed no one, who asked for little, and who endured her fate with grace rather than bitterness. a woman whose kindness showed in small gestures, the careful stitching of embroidered gifts, the quiet prayers whispered on behalf of others, the soft greetings she offered even when her body ached. These impressions, though fragile, suggest a life rich not in events, but in humanity. For modern readers, her life offers a powerful reminder that not all tragedies require flames, violence, or downfall. Some tragedies arise simply from being unseen. Maria Cristina's story echoes the experiences of countless individuals, particularly women, who lived their lives in the shadows of others' ambitions. Women whose stories were never told because they did not fit the mold of what chroniclers found meaningful. Women whose emotional and psychological realities were overshadowed by the demands of dynasty, patriarchy, or circumstance. Her legacy, then, is subtle but profound. It challenges us to reconsider what makes a life meaningful. It pushes us to remember that quiet souls deserve remembrance too, that dignity does not require drama, and that suffering does not need spectacle to be real. Through Maria Cristina, we see that the absence of legacy can be a legacy of its own, a powerful reminder of those countless lives that slipped away without anyone watching, reminding us that history's silence can be just as telling as its loudest narratives. In the end, Maria Cristina's life teaches us that visibility is not the sole measure of worth, and remembrance is not the only path to significance. Her story stands as a tribute to the gentle, the overlooked, and the forgotten. And in bringing her voice back into the light, we honor not just a single princess, but all those whose quiet tragedies were swallowed by the indifference of history. Maria Cristina's life does not end in grandeur, nor in scandal, nor in the kind of dramatic fall that draws historians for centuries. It ends exactly as it had always been lived, softly, quietly, in the gentle dimming of a woman the world never learned to see. But in that quiet lies a truth far more unsettling than any dramatic tragedy. That a human being can exist fully, breathe, hope, fear, love in small ways, and yet pass through history without leaving so much as an echo. Her story forces us to look not at the violence of fallen empires or the heroism of rulers, but at the silent damage inflicted by indifference. Maria Cristina was not destroyed by war, betrayal, or illness. She was undone by invisibility, by the simple fact that she did not fit the roles her world demanded, and therefore the world allowed her to fade. Her tragedy is not one of defeat, but of never being given the chance to fight at all. And yet, in her gentle endurance, there is something profoundly human. She did not rage against her fate or attempt to rewrite the life that had been laid before her. Instead, she bore it with a kind of quiet grace, finding small, fragile comforts in prayer, in modest routines, in the soft rituals of a woman who learned early that peace was the only thing she could claim as her own. She lived without applause, without recognition, and without bitterness. In remembering her now, tracing the faint outline she left behind, lifting her name from the dust of forgotten archives, we honor not the power she lacked, but the humanity she carried. Maria Cristina reminds us that history is not only made of those who shout the loudest, but also of those who whisper and are never heard. Her life stands as a memorial to every person who lived in the shadows, whose quiet suffering went unnoticed, whose story was swallowed by time. Her breath may have faded silently in a small, dim room. But in telling her story, we allow that final breath to be heard at last. Through remembrance, we offer her what life never gave her, a place in the light.